In the year 2035, a team aboard the Hermes spacecraft arrives on Mars for a 31-sol Martian Day mission. On the 18th sol, while investigating the region known as Acidalia planitia, the team's botanist, Mark, collects soil samples for chemical analysis. At that moment, Beth, the systems officer, receives a computer alert about an incoming dust storm and immediately informs the rest of the crew, urging them to return to the base, known as the habitat, or HAB. As the sky darkens and the storm nears, Mark and Alex, the team's chemist, suggest staying put and riding it out. However, their commander, Melissa, anticipates the storm's intensity will be too great, so she instructs everyone to prepare for evacuation. Once suited up, they open the HAB's main door and are instantly struck by the powerful wind and flying dust. Battling against the storm, they push forward toward the Mars Ascent Vehicle, MAV, with Mark staying behind briefly to secure the HAB door. Time is critical as there's a risk the MAV could tip over from the strong winds. Mark suggests they might stabilize it using cables and the rover. Suddenly, a communications dish is torn from its mount and hurtles through the air. The crew ducks to avoid it, but Mark is struck and thrown into the storm. The suit monitoring system detects a breach, and his life signs vanish from the sensors. Commander Melissa searches for him, but ultimately has to accept the likelihood that he didn't survive. Chris, the mission's medical officer, reminds her that a punctured suit in such conditions would mean certain death. Reluctantly, she gives the order to launch the MAV, and the team departs Mars, mourning the loss of their comrade. Back on Earth, NASA's administrator, Teddy, holds a press briefing announcing that the Mars crew is returning without one of their members. However, on the Martian surface, the storm eventually passes. Mark regains consciousness, his suit warning of dangerously low oxygen levels. A piece of antenna debris, still connected by wire, has pierced his suit but has also sealed the breach just enough to keep him alive. He cuts the wire, hurries back to the HAB, and painfully removes the embedded metal, first the visible part, then a remaining fragment using forceps, before patching the wound. He then logs into the Habitat's computer and begins recording a video diary to document his situation in case he doesn't survive. With the comm system destroyed, he has no way of reaching NASA. The next crewed mission isn't expected for another 4 years, and he doubts he can hold out that long. As another storm brews outside, he rests for most of the day, but boredom sets in. He begins organizing the HAB, cleaning up, and packing his crewmates' belongings into labeled storage. Seeing their photos strengthens his resolve. He refuses to die on Mars. The next morning, he takes inventory of the food supply, including a stash set aside for Thanksgiving that includes whole potatoes. That sparks an idea. Drawing on his botany expertise, Mark decides to grow a crop using Martian soil and the crew's processed waste as fertilizer. He plants the potatoes, but they'll require a substantial water supply. Fortunately, he has the materials and know how to construct a system that converts rocket fuel residue into water through combustion. His first attempt ignites a fire, but he recalculates and tries again, this time donning protective gear to stay safe. This time, the system functions correctly, allowing Mark to produce enough water both for his personal needs and to irrigate his crops. Over the following days, he maintains a rigorous routine, logging his progress through daily video entries, tending to his makeshift farm, and regularly cleaning the solar panels to ensure steady power. By the 54th sol, he's thrilled to see that the plants have begun to sprout. Back on Earth, the head of Mars operations, Vincent, approaches NASA Administrator Teddy with the idea of launching a follow-up mission much sooner than planned, rather than waiting the full 4-year gap since the previous one was cut short. Teddy is hesitant, arguing that a premature mission might only result in recovering Mark's remains, which wouldn't sit well with the public. Vincent counters by saying that if positioned right, the mission could be framed as a dignified retrieval for the sake of Mark's family. Soon after, at the Texas-based Space Command Center, a technician receives coordinates from Vincent and scans a section of Mars using a satellite feed. To her astonishment, the HAB appears to have been altered. She sounds the alarm, prompting Teddy, Vincent, and the Director of Communications, Annie, to rush to the facility. Upon viewing the data, they come to the startling realization that Mark is alive. A heated debate follows about how to manage public perception. Concerns include backlash over leaving someone behind and the emotional toll on the returning crew, who still don't know he survived. Teddy fears Mark's limited supplies will soon run out, while Vincent worries the psychological strain may be worsening if Mark believes he was abandoned. The next day, Teddy holds a press event to confirm that Mark is still alive, though he avoids answering detailed questions due to limited available information. The Hermes crew, still en route home, remains unaware of this development. By Sol 70, Mark begins to plan for long-term survival. He calculates that the next mission, scheduled to land over 3,200 kilometers from his current location, will require a journey he must prepare for. His main obstacle is mobility. The only operational rover has a maximum range of 35 kilometers per charge. Furthermore, the trip would take approximately 50 sols, meaning he'd have to live inside the cramped vehicle with very limited life support systems. By salvaging components from the damaged rover destroyed in the earlier storm, Mark manages to significantly extend the battery life of his working rover. During a night test, he realizes just how cold the Martian surface gets, but using the onboard heater would drain too much power. After returning to the hab, he concludes that his best option is to unearth the REG, radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a device powered by plutonium, a task that must be done with extreme caution. Carefully, Mark extracts the REG and successfully installs it in the rover to serve as a steady heat and power source. Meanwhile, Vincent speaks at a press conference to explain the movements seen in recent satellite images, speculating that Mark intends to reach the future landing zone. He adds that if communication were possible, NASA would advise him to stay put and wait for help. Teddy reprimands Vincent for making such assumptions public, as the feasibility of a rescue has not been confirmed. Still, Teddy orders his team to begin preparing a supply mission. When engineers tell him the process will take 9 months, he demands they complete it in just 3, by working non-stop. Flight Director Mitch urges Teddy to notify the Hermes crew about Mark's situation, but Teddy refuses, insisting they wait until a rescue becomes more certain. By Sol 79, Mark finally harvests his first successful potato crop. He replants the smaller ones and stores the larger ones as future food. Studying the map, he brainstorms ways to re-establish communication and comes up with a possible solution. He sets out in the rover, traveling in a direction that initially confuses NASA staff back on Earth. But when Vincent cross-checks the path with satellite maps, he suddenly realizes Mark's destination, an old Mars lander from a past mission. Moments later, Mark is seen digging through the sand to recover the Pathfinder probe, which had gone offline back in 1997. He transports it back to the habitat and begins attempts to restore it. Simultaneously, Vincent coordinates with engineers to prepare a replica of the original Pathfinder system, allowing them to create a compatible interface. Eventually, both systems establish a successful link, and images from Mars begin streaming in. Mark quickly sets up a series of signs in front of the camera, one asking if he's being seen, and 2 more labeled yes and no. When the NASA team remotely repositions the camera to point at yes, Mark celebrates, knowing he's finally made contact. Now, Mark faces the challenge of holding complex scientific discussions using only a camera and a set of signs. He retrieves Beth's laptop and discovers a reference table containing alphanumeric codes. Using these, he arranges markers around the Pathfinder probe to simulate a basic communication interface. NASA's technical team quickly deciphers his approach and replicates the same setup in their control room, creating a shared visual language. With the system in place, two-way messaging becomes possible. Mark shares how he managed to stay alive and emphasizes that none of it was due to any fault of his fellow crewmates. NASA then begins relaying technical steps to modify the rover so that it can relay messages through Pathfinder by adjusting its signal frequency. Mark carefully follows their instructions and soon receives a message from Vincent, who assures him they've been monitoring his progress and that people all over the globe are cheering for him. Vincent also informs him that efforts are underway to send a resupply mission. When Mark inquires about his crew, Vincent explains they've yet to be informed of his survival, as Mission Control wants them to stay focused on their journey back to Earth. Frustrated, Mark responds by typing out a series of profanity-laced replies, completely disrupting what was supposed to be a globally broadcast moment. To smooth things over, Teddy speaks with senior officials and argues that Mark's outburst was simply the result of extreme emotional strain. Meanwhile, Mitch takes a more direct approach. He secretly bypasses protocol and sends a message to the Hermes crew. After being away from Mars for 4 months, the astronauts receive an unexpected video addressed to all of them. They gather around a screen and watch as Mitch reveals the shocking news. Mark is alive. Just as predicted, the team is overwhelmed with guilt for having left him behind. By Sol 128, Mark expresses in his personal log that NASA keeps asking for updates on even the smallest tasks, right down to the details of his farming efforts. He's annoyed by what he sees as micromanagement of something he knows well. He's also received dozens of messages, including one from the president and another from his alma mater. They joke that by successfully growing crops on another planet, he's technically become the first person to colonize Mars. Mark runs with it, declaring himself Mars' first colonist. During a later communication, NASA asks him to pose for a photo to use for public outreach. Instead of something serious, Mark jokes around in front of the camera. Annie, NASA's media director, is irritated by his irreverence, but Teddy tells her to post it anyway, alongside the official announcement that a supply capsule will be launched and should arrive in roughly 9 months. While the food situation is manageable for now, Teddy remains concerned about the many things that could still go wrong. One evening, after completing some exterior maintenance, Mark re-enters the habitat, only to experience a sudden pressure failure. A violent decompression event sends the airlock flying across the terrain, eventually crashing some distance away. Though he survives the incident, his suit is damaged and oxygen begins to leak. Thinking quickly, Mark uses adhesive tape to seal the cracks and stabilizes his suit just in time. When he returns to the hab, he is devastated to find that the explosion destroyed all of his carefully tended crops. Gathering what supplies he can, Mark moves into the rover for the night, overwhelmed and shouting in frustration before sending a message to Mission Control. At NASA, Vincent informs the team that Mark's remaining food will last approximately 200 days. Teddy immediately issues an urgent directive to accelerate work on the supply probe. To help boost morale, NASA links Mark's communication system to the Hermes spacecraft, finally allowing him to exchange messages directly with his former crewmates. The following day, Mark clears out the ruined greenhouse and seals the breach caused by the blast. That night, he tries to stretch his remaining potatoes through careful rationing, but the howling of yet another Martian storm adds to his mounting anxiety. Back on Earth, an orbital specialist named Rich discusses the probe's trajectory with a colleague. While joking about the poor current alignment of Earth and Mars, he suddenly has a flash of inspiration. An unconventional idea begins to form. While Teddy continues to look for loopholes in standard procedures to speed things up, Mark reaches day 154 on Mars. He's reduced his food intake to the bare essentials and starts combining his meals with medications to stretch his supplies. Nearly a month later, the new supply probe is prepped for launch, and the entire NASA team gathers to witness the event. Initially, everything seems fine, but soon a severe misalignment becomes apparent, and within moments, the probe explodes. The mood at Mission Control turns grim. It falls on Vincent to deliver the devastating news to Mark, who had asked for an update. On day 186, Mark sends a heartfelt message to Commander Melissa, requesting that she visit his parents once she's back on Earth and tell them about everything they experienced on Mars. He wants them to know he loves them and that he found meaning in what he did, even if it cost him his life. Meanwhile, officials at China's National Space Agency are watching Teddy's interview, where he admits the failure was due to skipping inspection protocols to save time. They realize their classified heavy-lift launch vehicle could help, but using it would require complete secrecy to avoid exposing national technology. After deliberation, they contact Teddy, who agrees to the confidential terms. As NASA races to build a new probe in just 28 days, Rich, the astrodynamicist, finalizes a new plan. He travels to brief Vincent personally, using an office demonstration involving a stapler, Annie, and Teddy to explain it. Rather than sending the resupply directly to Mars, Rich proposes rerouting it to intercept the Hermes. The crew could retrieve the cargo, perform a gravity-assisted slingshot around Earth, and return to Mars for a quicker rescue of Mark, who would need to rendezvous with them at the Mars Ascent Vehicle, MAV. The downside? This maneuver would extend the crew's mission by roughly 500 days. Mitch argues that Melissa and the crew deserve the chance to decide for themselves, but Teddy refuses, fearing the risk of losing the entire mission team. He insists on sticking with the current plan. However, on the Hermes, Beth discovers a hidden transmission and decodes it, revealing Rich's alternate strategy. The crew meets to discuss their options. Melissa reminds them of the serious consequences, delaying their return by over a year, facing charges for insubordination, and the possibility that the maneuver could fail. Even so, the team unanimously agrees to proceed. Back at NASA, Beth sends a cheeky message about Rich just before they realize Hermes has changed course. With the crew having made their choice, Teddy has no choice but to brief the media, so he instructs Annie to go public with the new plan. He also confronts Mitch, correctly assuming he leaked the plan to the Hermes crew. Teddy informs him that once the mission ends, he'll need to step down. By day 219, Mark begins retrofitting the rover to carry all the supplies he'll need for the long journey to the distant crater where the second MAV is located. NASA runs parallel simulations in their labs and sends him continuous updates. Chinese scientists also arrive at NASA to help with the booster project, though coordination is sometimes hampered by language and cultural differences. Meanwhile, the Hermes team contacts their families to share the emotional news. They won't be returning home for another 500 days. Mark finally completes the rover modifications and takes it on a test drive to confirm everything's in working order. The joint US-China booster is successfully tested, and the new probe is launched without any issues. The Hermes intercepts the cargo pod near Earth and integrates it with the ship. After another 7 months pass, Mark prepares to leave the hab for good. He records one final log entry, powers down the habitat systems, and marks day 461 on the wall with his signature before climbing into the rover. The road ahead is long, and he must pause frequently to recharge the rover's batteries using solar panels he brought from the hab. During each break while the rover charges, Mark takes a moment to appreciate the Martian scenery, reminding himself that he's the first human to ever set foot in many of these remote places. He also takes short naps during this downtime. On day 517, Mitch and the engineering team uncover a major problem. The Hermes can't safely enter Mars orbit without exhausting the fuel needed for the return journey. Meanwhile, the Mars Ascent Vehicle, MAV, can only reach a low orbit, which means Mark will need to achieve a much higher velocity to break free of Mars gravity. To make this happen, they must reduce the MAV's weight by 5,000 kilograms. Mitch suggests stripping it of everything unnecessary: seats, controls, and even parts of the life support systems. Mark will have to rely entirely on his suit for oxygen, and the crew aboard Hermes will have to control the ascent remotely, with no backup communication. To complicate things further, they'll need to detach the front airlock and windows, replacing the top of the MAV with a tarp-like covering to cut down even more weight. It's an incredibly risky operation, and the odds aren't in their favor, but there's no alternative. When Mark receives the outline of the plan, his response is a blunt expletive. By day 538, he finally reaches the crater and records another log entry venting about how absurd the plan is. Still, he admits that the idea of becoming the fastest person in spaceflight history has its appeal. He begins dismantling the MAV, removing every non-essential component and preparing the canvas cover. By day 560, Melissa reviews the rescue plan with the crew, assigning roles to each member to ensure everything runs smoothly. They're prepared to leave the Hermes if necessary to retrieve their friend. The following day, Mark eats the last of his food and writes a message for the future explorer who might find the rover, asking them to take care of it since it kept him alive. Back on Earth, massive crowds gather outside NASA facilities and in cities across the globe to watch the final rescue attempt. Mark trims his beard, cuts his hair, suits up, and boards the MAV. With Hermes now within range, he can talk to the crew directly instead of relying on text messages. Overcome with emotion, he thanks them for coming back for him. Melissa begins the countdown, and the MAV launches successfully. However, a few minutes into the flight, the canvas rips away, destabilizing the cabin pressure and causing Mark to lose consciousness. The Hermes team shuts off the booster remotely and soon realizes that the MAV has run out of fuel, leaving it farther away than planned. They can compensate by using their reserve thrusters, but that would make their speed too great for a safe rendezvous. Mark wakes up, groggy and bruised, and jokes that he's fine, apart from possibly fractured ribs. When he hears about the situation, he suggests a wild idea: puncturing his suit and using the escaping air as a makeshift jet to propel himself toward the ship. It's reckless, but it gives Melissa an idea. They can blow an airlock and use the force of the escaping air as a propellant. It's dangerous, but they're out of alternatives. Melissa asks Alex to rig an improvised explosive using ship supplies, including sugar. The resulting bomb, more powerful than expected, is placed on the airlock by Chris, who floats to safety. Calculations show there will still be a small gap between Mark and Hermes, so Melissa decides to go out herself and suits up. When the airlock is detonated, it creates the thrust they need. As the Hermes moves into position, Chris helps secure Melissa for a spacewalk. Unfortunately, the tether isn't long enough. Mark then follows through with his original idea. He punctures his suit, and the pressure propels him into space. He spins uncontrollably at first, but manages to stabilize and exit the MAV. With the help of her team tracking the trajectory, Melissa adjusts her course and reaches out as Mark speeds by. Their hands collide, but not quite in a grip. Luckily, Mark catches the rope tether, and Melissa hauls him in. The crew helps them back into Hermes and confirms the successful recovery to Earth. Celebrations erupt worldwide. Once safely back on Earth and fully recovered, Mark takes on a new role, teaching astronaut trainees survival techniques. 3 years later, a new mission to Mars launches, this time with everything they learned from his journey shaping the future. And that was the story of this film. What did you think about it? Let us know in the comments.